First, the cold that kills. Before you realize it, most people think the cold kills loudly. They imagine icy winds, cracking branches, storms tearing across the night sky. But history tells a quieter story. The deadliest cold is the one you never notice until your body has already surrendered. It creeps in softly, in the dark, when everything still feels bearable, right before it isn't. In the frozen forests and mountains of World War II, thousands of soldiers learned this truth the hard way. They didn't die because they lacked courage or discipline or even proper uniforms. They died because the cold attacks differently than any enemy they had ever trained for. It doesn't strike with drama, it simply drains the body, minute by minute, until strength collapses into stillness. Military records show that countless soldiers never made it to dawn, even though they weren't exhausted, wounded, or starving. They simply lost heat faster than they could produce it. And this happened not because their clothing failed, but because they misunderstood the true physics of staying alive. Cold is not something you fight harder, it is something you must contain. This idea, simple and brutal, became the dividing line between waking up alive and never waking up at all. Second, why modern cold weather gear fails in real war conditions. Modern people love to think technology solves everything. We imagine that a thick sleeping bag, a thermal liner, or an insulated jacket is the ultimate answer to a winter night outdoors. And yes, in controlled conditions, these tools are brilliant. They work beautifully when the ground is dry, when the air is still, and when you have the luxury of choosing where to sleep. But soldiers in World War II had none of these conditions. They bivouacked in frozen swamps, on ground that sucked heat like a living creature, in trenches filled with melting snow, and on mountain slopes where the wind sliced across their bodies long before the night even began. They slept where they fell, not where they preferred, and when the order came to move, they moved. Heavy sleeping bags were often abandoned during rapid advances and retreats because weight meant death. Speed, not comfort, kept you alive. Even when soldiers did have sleeping bags, the physics still worked against them. Insulation collapses when wet. Down loses loft. Wool absorbs moisture. And when insulation loses loft, it stops trapping air. Without trapped air, there is no warmth. Add even the smallest breeze, and heat is stripped from the body faster than any layer can replace it. This is why soldiers quickly realized a painful truth. Insulation alone was never going to save them. A thick layer keeps you warm only if the surrounding air remains still. But on a battlefield, the air is never still. Mountain winds tear into fibers, while forest drafts creep into everything. A sleeping bag may work in the wilderness today, but on the battlegrounds of 1943, it was often useless before midnight. Out of necessity, a new mindset emerged. Soldiers stopped relying on gear that demanded perfect conditions. Instead, they built a system that worked under the worst conditions imaginable. One that ignored comfort and focused solely on survival. Because insulation without wind control is not warmth, it is a beautiful lie. Third, the forgotten rule of winter survival. Air movement matters more than layers. To understand why soldiers turned away from sleeping bags and towards something entirely different, you must understand one of the most overlooked truths in cold weather survival. The body doesn't lose heat in just one way. It loses heat through conduction when you lie on cold ground. It loses heat through evaporation when moisture or sweat pulls warmth away from your skin. But its most ruthless enemy is convection moving air. A breeze so gentle you barely feel it can steal heat from your body faster than a 15-degree drop in temperature. This is the rule most civilians overlook, and the rule most soldiers learned only through suffering. You could wear 4 layers, 5 layers, even 6, but if the wind reached your skin, you were done. The cold didn't need to be dramatic, it simply needed to move. Veterans later described nights when they felt warm enough, only to wake up shivering uncontrollably, their core temperature already sliding downward. Others never woke up at all. The lesson became clear. It wasn't about how much insulation you had. It was about whether the air around your body was allowed to move. And this is the forgotten rule of winter survival. Stop the air and the cold loses its weapon. Control airflow and you control life. Ignore airflow and no amount of clothing will save you. This single understanding, this shift from warming yourself to protecting your heat, set the stage for one of the most ingenious, overlooked, and life-saving battlefield improvisations of the entire war. A system born not from engineers or scientists, but from ordinary soldiers who refused to freeze to death. Fourth, birth of the shelter tube, a system, not a product. The most remarkable survival tools in history were never designed in laboratories or issued from factories. They were born in desperation, shaped by men who understood that the night did not care about comfort, and the cold did not wait for permission. The shelter tube is the perfect example of this truth. It wasn't invented, it wasn't standardized, and no nation stamped it with a serial number. It emerged because soldiers across different armies, facing the same brutal physics, reached the same conclusion at the same time. German mountain troops discovered the idea first in the high Alps, using their triangular Zeltbahn ponchos to create long, narrow cylinders that trapped warm air inside. American mountain divisions later adopted a similar approach while fighting through the freezing slopes of Italy, where the wind cut so sharply that even a moment of exposure could leave fingers numb beyond recovery. On the vast and merciless Eastern Front, Soviet winter troops formed comparable cocoon-like tubes, often burying them partially in snow to stabilize their internal temperature. These armies never coordinated with each other. They simply arrived at the same method because the alternative was freezing to death. The common thread across all these fronts was the same: no time, no luxury, and no perfect gear. Soldiers didn't have hours to pitch tents or spread out equipment. They didn't have dry ground, thick pads, or relief from the wind. They had only what they carried, the fabric on their backs, and the determination to live until morning. The shelter tube did not make them warm in the usual sense. It merely stopped the brutal loss of heat long enough for their bodies to survive the night. The tube didn't add warmth, it prevented loss. And on a battlefield ruled by cold, that difference meant everything. Fifth, when the records speak, documented military evidence. For anyone who doubts whether the shelter tube was truly used, the historical record speaks clearly. This was not a myth whispered through generations, nor a rumor passed among survivalists decades later. The method appears again and again in the accounts of men who survived Europe's harshest winters and in the doctrines of units trained specifically for mountain warfare. German troops stationed in the Alps wrote about sleeping shoulder to shoulder inside improvised cylinders to stay alive during blizzards that buried equipment in minutes. American soldiers climbing the Italian Apennines recalled wrapping shelter halves into tight tubes when wind tore through every other form of cover they had tried. Soviet writings from the Eastern Front describe soldiers sealing themselves into snow-lined cocoons, creating a dead air chamber warm enough to keep their boots from freezing solid by morning. Military cold weather manuals, especially those developed during and immediately after the war, emphasize many of the same principles used in the shelter tube: reducing interior volume, creating still air pockets, sealing wind paths, and relying on body heat as the primary energy source. These were not poetic retellings, they were instructions forged through necessity. This method survived not because it was clever, but because it worked, repeatedly. Sixth, why the cylinder shape saves lives. At first glance, the shelter tube looks crude, even primitive, just canvas wrapped around shivering soldiers. But the deeper truth is far more elegant. The cylinder shape is not an accident. It is a geometry of survival, a form nature has used for thousands of years to conserve heat in the harshest environments. A flat shelter loses warmth on every side. Warm air rises, spills out, and is replaced by cold drafts that creep in through every gap. But a cylinder traps air in a closed loop. There are no corners for warmth to escape through, and no flat surfaces for wind to strip clean. The rounded shape minimizes exposed surface area, which means less heat is lost for every breath a soldier takes. Inside the tube, the body becomes the furnace, and the shape becomes the chamber that holds its heat. Then comes the snow, misunderstood by many as an enemy. In reality, snow is one of the best natural insulators on Earth. When packed around a shelter tube, it transforms the crude cylinder into a thermal shell, stabilizing internal temperatures even when the world outside falls far below zero. This is the same principle Inuit hunters relied on in snow shelters, the same principle Viking families used in their thick turf houses, And the same principle frontier settlers depended on when building dugouts on the Great Plains. Different cultures, different centuries, but the same physics. Shape is survival engineering. And the cylinder is one of the most efficient shapes ever discovered for keeping life alive against the cold. 7. Sleeping fully dressed, a decision modern people fear. To modern campers, the idea of sleeping fully dressed sounds uncomfortable, even wrong. We are taught to change into dry layers, remove boots, and keep our clothing clean and warm for the next day. But for soldiers in World War II, this advice would have been fatal. They slept exactly as they marched. Boots on, coats on, belts buckled, and every layer kept close to the skin. There was a brutal logic behind this choice. If a soldier took off his boots at night, even for a moment, the leather could freeze solid by morning. In the time it took to thaw them, the enemy could advance, orders could change, or the temperature could drop so sharply that bare feet on cold ground meant instant injury. Mobility was life. Losing time meant losing everything. The cold did not care if your socks were dry or if your boots were comfortable. It cared only that the moment your feet touched frozen leather, you could no longer move. Sleeping fully dressed also preserved the fragile warmth trapped inside the shelter tube. Every piece of fabric, every pocket of trapped air acted like a small heat battery. Removing layers would have drained that system instantly. The soldiers who survived understood that comfort was not a priority. Staying alive required discipline, not softness. This was the divide between those who froze and those who saw the sunrise. Comfort is optional, mobility is not. 8. Heat sharing. Why two survived where one died. If you want to understand the true power of the shelter tube, you must understand the physics of human heat. A single body inside a tube produces a predictable amount of warmth. But when 2 or even 3 bodies share that same confined space, the temperature does not merely double. It rises exponentially. This is because heat generation scales faster than heat loss. 2 soldiers together create twice the thermal output, yet the surface area through which that heat can escape does not double. The tube remains the same size, the same shape, the same protective shell, but now it is fed by multiple living furnaces working in unison. In that small cylinder, the laws of physics reward cooperation. The more bodies inside, the warmer and more stable the interior climate becomes. Veterans described moments when climbing into a tube alone felt barely tolerable, but joining a companion transformed the inside into a pocket of survivable warmth within minutes. They were not being sentimental or heroic. They were applying physics in the most practical way imaginable. Facing the cold as an individual meant surrendering energy faster than the environment could return it. But facing it together meant amplifying the one resource the cold could not steal: shared heat. This brutally simple truth shattered the illusion of individualism on winter battlefields. No one fought the cold alone and won. The shelter tube forced soldiers to rely on one another, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. Survival is communal physics. 9th, condensation is not failure. It is a triad. Many modern outdoor enthusiasts fear moisture more than cold itself. They worry that the moment a shelter becomes damp, disaster is imminent. But World War II soldiers learned a different lesson altogether. Condensation inside a shelter tube was not a sign of failure. It was part of the price of survival. When soldiers sealed themselves inside their makeshift cylinders, their breath and body heat naturally created moisture. Instead of absorbing into down or wool, that moisture would bead on the inner walls of the canvas. This meant the insulation, what little they had, remained dry enough to function. The tube acted like a vapor barrier, catching the moisture where it could do the least harm. The men inside accepted this dampness willingly. They understood that being slightly wet but warm was far better than being perfectly dry but exposed to wind. Condensation stayed on the walls, not in their insulation, and during daylight hours, the fabric could be shaken out, aired briefly, and reused. This approach foreshadowed what modern survivalists now call vapor barrier theory, controlling where moisture goes instead of trying to avoid it entirely. The soldiers of World War II were not aiming for comfort. They were making calculated trades: a little dampness for a stable microclimate, wet canvas for warm bodies, controlled moisture instead of uncontrolled heat loss. This is why the shelter tube worked even under the harshest winter conditions. Moisture management beats moisture avoidance. 10th. Why history abandoned the shelter tube. It is tempting to assume that the shelter tube disappeared because it was crude, outdated, or inferior. But history rarely works that way. Many of the most effective survival systems ever created were quietly dropped, not because they failed, but because peace changed what people valued. After World War II, the world shifted rapidly toward comfort, convenience, and aesthetics. Soldiers returned home and wanted soft beds, warm houses, new technologies, and a life far removed from the brutal improvisations that had kept them alive. Civilian outdoor culture soon followed the same path. Marketing promised warmth through gear, not through understanding. Sleeping bags became thicker, tents became lighter, jackets became flashier, and stores filled with equipment designed to make winter feel safe and easy. None of these products encouraged the mindset soldiers had learned, that survival is a system, not an object. That warmth is trapped, not purchased. That shape and airflow matter as much as clothing. The shelter tube was inconvenient, uncomfortable, and unattractive. No company could mass-produce it profitably, and no customer would choose it over a sleek, insulated bag. It offered no luxury, only survival. And survival does not sell well, so the method faded from memory, replaced by gear that worked beautifully in catalogs but often failed in the uncontrolled chaos of real cold. What saves lives rarely sells well, and the shelter tube became another casualty of a world that prefers comfort over understanding. 11th. Applying shelter tube logic in modern America. If the story ended in 1945, it would simply be history. But it doesn't. The same physics that saved soldiers in World War II still governs every winter night in America today. The grid can fail. Cars slide off icy roads. Families find themselves stranded during blizzards or blackouts. Rural communities face storms that cut them off from help, and when the cold closes in, the body cares nothing for brands, fabrics, or marketing. It cares only for heat, volume, and wind. This is why the logic of the shelter tube remains powerful. You don't need World War II gear to apply it. A tarp, a heavy blanket, a poncho, or even durable plastic sheeting can be shaped into a cylinder wide enough for your body but tight enough to trap still air. The goal is not to build comfort, but to build containment. Minimize internal volume. Block wind from every direction. Use the snow around you as insulation rather than treating it as a threat. Place clothing or a jacket beneath you to reduce heat loss into the ground. And if you have another person with you, share the space. Two bodies inside a small tube generate far more warmth than one. During blackouts, people often pile on blankets but fail to control airflow. During car breakdowns, they sit upright in a large cold cabin instead of reducing air volume around their bodies. During rural emergencies, they fear moisture instead of controlling where it goes. But once you understand the shelter tube's logic, every object around you becomes a potential survival tool. You don't need old gear. You need old thinking. 12th. The real lesson. Systems outlive technology. The shelter tube is more than a wartime improvisation. It is a reminder of a deeper truth that spans civilizations. Throughout history, the people who survived harsh winters were those who understood systems, not gadgets. Vikings engineered layered floors of turf and stone to trap warmth. Medieval builders learned to direct airflow through thick-walled homes. American frontier settlers carved dugouts into hillsides to use earth as insulation. All of these methods relied on physics, not products. The shelter tube belongs in this lineage. It is a proof of concept that technology is optional, but understanding is not. Gear becomes obsolete, but principles endure. The same logic that kept soldiers alive in snow-choked forests echoes in every survival trick humans have used for thousands of years. What matters most is not what you carry, but what you know. History remembers what marketing forgets, and the shelter tube is one of those overlooked pieces of wisdom that deserves to be reclaimed. 13th. Closing. Survival is not about buying, it is about seeing. The cold does not kill foolish people. It kills people who underestimate it. It kills those who believe comfort will protect them, or that gear will save them, or that warmth is something you wear rather than something you preserve. Winter punishes assumptions quickly and without mercy. History, when read carefully, is not just a collection of stories. It is a survival manual written in frost, in mistakes, and in the quiet tragedies of those who learned too late. The shelter tube stands as a reminder that even in the deadliest conditions, humans endure when they understand the rules of their environment. Shelter tubes didn't keep soldiers warm. They kept soldiers alive long enough for warmth to matter.